Whitney Houston was a voice that defined an era, a reminder that true greatness announces itself and never really leaves. Toby Keith built an empire from unapologetic American pride. His story was about owning exactly who you are. Gilbert Gottfried, the loudest, most abrasive voice in the room, and somehow always the one you remembered. Liam Payne showed that even a global stage can be a complicated place to stand. David McCallum spent 6 decades in front of a camera, quietly becoming one of the most durable presences in television history. Matthew Perry made the whole world laugh and reminded us that the funniest people are often carrying the most weight. There is a moment, January 20th, 2025, when Donald Trump walked back into the White House for the second time, raised his right hand, and took the oath of office again. No American president had done that in over a century. Grover Cleveland managed it in 1893. Before January 6th, before the indictments, before the mugshot that became a campaign poster, almost no one would have predicted the story would bend this way. And yet, that is the thing about Donald Trump. He has spent 5 decades defying the endings other people wrote for him. But to understand what that second inauguration meant, you have to go back not to his childhood, not to his first skyscraper, but to the moment the story seemed, to almost everyone watching, to be over. It was the evening of November 8th, 2022. Republicans had expected a wave election. Instead, the midterms delivered something closer to a trickle. Candidates Trump had personally endorsed, many of them running on his stolen election platform, lost races that should have been winnable. Within days, the party's donor class began whispering a name: Ron DeSantis. Rupert Murdoch's New York Post ran a cover calling Trump Trumpty Dumpty. The verdict from the political establishment, and even from corners of his own movement, was that he was a liability, a spent force, a man whose moment had passed. Trump announced his 2024 presidential campaign 11 days after those midterms, earlier than anyone expected, partly to freeze the field, partly because early announcement was a legal shield, and partly because Donald Trump does not wait for permission to re-enter a room. It did not go smoothly at first. The crowd at Mar-a-Lago that night was smaller than his team had hoped. The energy felt flat compared to his 2016 rallies. Donors held back. For 6 months, DeSantis polled within striking distance. And then, one by one, 4 criminal indictments arrived. And something strange happened. Each indictment boosted his poll numbers. The Georgia mugshot, the first sitting or former president ever photographed that way, was turned into merchandise within hours. His campaign raised millions in the days that followed each court filing. What should have been a series of political crises became, in the eyes of his base, a series of confirmations. The system was after him. That narrative, which he had been constructing since at least 2015, had never felt more viscerally real to his supporters. By the time the Republican primary debates began in August 2023, Trump simply refused to show up. He sat for a competing interview with Tucker Carlson on X, then Twitter, while the other candidates argued on stage without him. His rivals spent the night attacking each other. None of them ever truly landed a blow on the man who wasn't in the room. It was a masterclass in dominance by absence. To understand how a real estate developer from Queens became the most polarizing political figure in modern American history, you have to reckon with the particular nature of the brand he spent 40 years building before he ever ran for office. Fred Trump, his father, was a disciplined, unsentimental builder of modest middle-class housing in Brooklyn and Queens. Donald was the fourth of 5 children, born June 14, 1946. He was sent at 13 to the New York Military Academy, partly because he was difficult to manage, partly because Fred believed structure was the thing that separated successful men from unsuccessful ones. What Donald absorbed from that institution was not quite military discipline. By most accounts, he was competitive and cocky and not especially academic, but something more useful to him: the theater of authority. The way a uniform and a posture and a certain projected confidence could make others arrange themselves around you. He enrolled at Fordham, transferred to the Wharton School at Penn, graduated in 1968, and returned to his father's company. But Fred's world, affordable rentals in the outer boroughs, was not the world Donald wanted. He wanted Manhattan. He wanted towers with his name on them. He wanted the cover of the New York Times magazine, which he got in 1976, the year he was 30 years old, and had just secured the lease on the old Commodore Hotel near Grand Central, a deal that required convincing the nearly bankrupt city of New York to grant him a 40-year tax abatement. It was an audacious ask. He got it. Trump Tower followed. Opened in 1983 on Fifth Avenue, it was not just an address, it was a statement about what Manhattan could look like when ambition and marketing fused. The pink marble atrium, the gold-plated everything. Critics called it garish. People lined up to see it. That tension between the aesthetic judgment of elites and the visceral appeal to a broader public would define his career for the next 4 decades. The 1980s were his decade. He published The Art of the Deal in 1987, ghostwritten by Tony Schwartz, and it became one of the best-selling business books in American history. It sold a version of Trump that was more myth than record, the master negotiator, the instinctive genius. And it worked because enough people wanted to believe that getting rich was a learnable art, and that here was the man who had mastered it. He owned casinos in Atlantic City. He owned a football team in the USFL. He owned the Plaza Hotel. He was a gossip column fixture, a tabloid character, a very specific fantasy about what success looked like. And then the early 1990s arrived and very nearly ended him. The Atlantic City casinos, the Taj Mahal, the Plaza, the Castle, went bankrupt. His airline failed. The Plaza Hotel went into receivership. His personal debt was estimated at roughly $900 million. It was a spectacular implosion, covered with barely concealed glee by the same press that had lionized him a few years earlier. Any ordinary business story would have ended there, but Trump had something the creditors wanted more than his liquidation: his name. The banks, partly because they were so deep in his debt they couldn't afford to let him fail, restructured rather than foreclosed. He kept the brand. He rebuilt on a different model, one that was less about owning assets and more about licensing his name to people who wanted to borrow his image. Golf courses, hotels, condominiums, branded steaks, bottled water. The product was less a thing than a feeling. The feeling of a certain kind of winner. The Apprentice arrived in 2004 and completed what the bankruptcies had started to unravel. 15 seasons on NBC, 28 million viewers at its peak. The boardroom. The finger-pointing. You're fired. What the show constructed was a character, decisive, ruthless, infallible, that had almost no relationship to the actual business record. The man on television was the platonic ideal of the Trump brand, and tens of millions of Americans watched it every week for years. By the time he rode the escalator down at Trump Tower on June 16, 2015, and announced his presidential campaign, He was not really a businessman entering politics. He was a character entering the arena he'd been circling for 30 years. He had flirted with a presidential run in 1988, 1999, 2011. He had spent years amplifying the birther conspiracy about Barack Obama, a racially charged disinformation campaign that earned him attention, credibility in certain quarters, and the deep, permanent hatred of others. None of that was incidental. All of it was runway. The 2016 campaign was unlike anything the modern political system had encountered. He defeated 16 Republican primary opponents, many of them experienced politicians with serious records, by treating the entire enterprise as a reality show in which he was the only character worth watching. He coined nicknames. He dominated coverage. He said things on television that political consultants had spent decades advising candidates never to say, and discovered that some of those rules were not laws of physics, but just conventions, and that conventions could be broken by someone willing to absorb the consequences. The general election against Hillary Clinton was close. He lost the popular vote by nearly 3 million. He won the Electoral College 306 to 232. On November 9th, 2016, the world woke up to the 45th president-elect of the United States, and neither his supporters nor his opponents quite knew what to make of it. His presidency was a sustained disruption of normal political operations. He cut taxes, most significantly for corporations, in the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the single largest legislative achievement of his first term. He remade the federal judiciary, appointing 3 Supreme Court justices, Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett. The Dobbs decision that overturned Roe v. Wade in 2022 was downstream of those appointments. He withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement, the Iran nuclear deal, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He launched a trade war with China, imposing tariffs that disrupted supply chains in ways economists are still arguing about. He pushed a policy of aggressive immigration enforcement that was cheered by his base and condemned by immigration advocates as cruel. He held a summit with Kim Jong-un in Singapore, the first sitting American president to meet a North Korean leader, a meeting that produced photographs and headlines, but no lasting denuclearization. The first impeachment, in December 2019, centered on a phone call to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, in which Trump asked for an investigation into Joe Biden's son in exchange for releasing congressionally approved military aid. The Senate acquitted him. The second impeachment, in January 2021, charged him with incitement of insurrection following the assault on the Capitol on January 6th. The Senate acquitted him again, though 7 Republican senators voted to convict, the most bipartisan vote for conviction in any presidential impeachment trial in history. January 6th, 2021, is the event that will anchor every future historical account of his first term. A crowd he had spent weeks rallying with claims that the election had been stolen marched to the Capitol while Congress was certifying the results. They broke through police lines, shattered windows, occupied the Senate chamber. 4 people died that day. A Capitol police officer died the following day. Trump watched it on television from the White House dining room for hours before releasing a video that told the rioters he loved them. What he did not do, for hours, was call it off. The years between the White House and his return were not quiet. He was indicted in 4 separate criminal cases: federal charges related to the handling of classified documents, federal charges related to efforts to overturn the 2020 election, and state charges in Georgia on the same subject. He became the first former American president to be convicted of a felony found guilty on 34 counts of falsifying business records in New York in May 2024. His supporters pointed to prosecutorial bias. His critics pointed to the verdict. Both things existed simultaneously in American public life, as they almost always do with Trump. And then he won. November 5th, 2024, he beat Kamala Harris, who had replaced an ailing Joe Biden as the Democratic nominee in both the Electoral College and the popular vote. He became only the second president in American history to win non-consecutive terms. The second term arrived with a different energy than the first. There was no improvisation of a campaign outsider learning the government. Trump arrived with personnel lists, executive order drafts, a project called Schedule F that reclassified tens of thousands of federal workers as political appointees eligible for removal, and a broader agenda that moved faster in its first weeks than almost any administration in modern memory. Whether that speed produces durable policy change or institutional damage, or both, is a question American institutions are still trying to answer. What is not a question is what Donald Trump has done to American politics. He has permanently altered the Republican Party, reorienting it away from free trade, internationalism, and small government orthodoxy toward economic nationalism and a politics of grievance and cultural warfare that maps far better onto the actual anxieties of its working-class base. He has demonstrated that the gatekeeping functions of party establishments, mainstream media, and professional political consultants are more fragile than anyone understood. He has made hostility to elite institutions not a political liability, but a political asset. He has also normalized things that had not previously been normal. A former president photographed for a mugshot, a president who refused to commit to a peaceful transfer of power, a candidate who campaigned while under active criminal prosecution, a president returning to office after a single-term loss. The argument about what those normalizations mean, whether they are symptoms of a democracy under stress or expressions of a democracy demanding accountability from its own institutions, is an argument that has no clean resolution. It is the argument Americans are living through right now. Donald Trump turns 79 in June 2025. He is the oldest person ever to serve as President of the United States. He is, by any accounting, one of the most consequential figures in American political history. Consequential not because all of his consequences have been good, or because he intended all of them, but because the country looks measurably different because of the path he has walked through it. The towers still carry his name. The cases are still winding through appeals. The base is still there. And the story, characteristically defiantly,